Well, thanks to Xander for setting this whole thing up and coordinating this webinar. This is my first time presenting as a webinar, though I did listen to one last month and I really enjoyed it. I also want to thank the Southwest Fire Consortium for coordinating this event as well. And so I'm going to present today some results from my dissertation. So I did my PhD at the University of Arizona with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, and I worked primarily with Tom Swetnam and Chris Mason. They provided a lot of guidance and support on my research. Let's see, what else? I'd like to, of course, acknowledge the Joint Fire Sciences Program. I got some scholarship support from them to work on this, as well as from other organizations. And so this is a study of fire and climate history from the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. And what really kind of motivated this work is this work also grew out of my master's degree, which was to compare tree ring methods of fire history with sediment methods of fire history, and to sort of see what we could learn from each method and how they could complement each other, and then sort of be valuable for interpreting fire and climate relations over several thousand years. Here we go. So I'm going to go through about 9 or 10 slides of background. It's quite a bit of background, but since I wasn't sure, entirely who the audience would be, I think it's all relevant to go through kind of what the reasons are for doing this work and why it's important. And then I'll continue with sort of the specifics of my study and how I sampled tree ring methods for fire history, and that covers roughly a 300-year time period. And then the last part will be reviewing the methods and results from alluvial-sediment methods, which covers a couple thousand years. And as I go, feel free. I'm going to get to if people want to type in questions. Xander can mediate that, and I'm happy to stop and answer questions along the way, as well as at the end. Let me get started. So some of the motivation for this work is that basically in the last 10 years we've seen increasing area burned in forests of the Southwest, and a lot of the area burned is driven by a couple of large events that are really tied to severe drought years. So one example is 2002 was a major drought year across the Intermountain West, and that there were extremely large fires in Arizona and Colorado and other places in that year, in particular the Rodeo Chetasky fire and the Hayman fire. And a lot of these, some of these large fires also had extremely large patches of high severity fire. And if we were to continue, let's see, if we were to continue this graph out here, sort of into the last 5 years, 2011 would probably plot right up here. So there was quite, 2011 was also a really big fire year with some of the largest fires in Arizona and New Mexico, and also pretty severe drought year as well. So that's something that has, caught people's attention and really put emphasis on understanding past, the relationship between fire and climate change, as well as sort of what is the natural role of fire in our landscape. So tree ring records and historical documents point to the fact that particularly in pine-dominated ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, prior to the late 1800s, there was low-severity surface fires that was common in the forest, and then kind of starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, natural fires were suppressed, and then grazing also ate up a lot of the fuels that prevented low severity surface fires from spreading in the forest. So the result of this was to have, now we have very dense forests with a lot of small diameter trees in the understory, and the species composition has also shifted to have more shade-tolerant species in the understory as well, so firs and particularly white fir and Doug fir in the understory of pine forest. So,
Erica, Xander, let me interrupt just 1 second. Yeah. We're having a little bit of background noise, and I wonder if it's probably worth trying to call back in with that moderator code so that we can mute everybody else.
Yeah. So should I call in again?
Yeah, if you don't mind. And the code that you need is that 8908235 pound.
Yep.
Oh,
okay.
Actually, now maybe our background noise has stopped.
I can call back. Should I call back in with that other number?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that just so we have a nice, clear channel. And
All right.
I'll entertain everybody with jokes while we're waiting.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So I apologize to everybody for this momentary delay, but I think it will help, particularly in the recording and enabling everybody to hear the data more clearly. So Erica should be back in a second here, and then we'll go ahead and mute all the participants. Now, of course, it's totally silent in the background, but it sounded like somebody was rearranging their office while listening to the webinar.
Okay.
Thank you, Erica. So I'm going to try muting the participants. We should still be able to hear you.
Okay.
Yes, we can. So I'm sorry about that, but please continue.
Thanks. Okay, so let's see here. So just looking at sort of these lower two examples, or some of the right-hand example photo is from the Los Conchas fire, I believe. So big high-severity fire with huge high-severity patches that burned in 2011. And then on the left is a picture of just drought-related pinyon mortality, also from northern New Mexico. So these are some of the impacts that we've seen so far, kind of in the early 2000s, which is sort of this part of the graphic here. And this is just, this black line represents kind of a measure of drought severity. So lower here, low values tend to represent warmer and drier climate conditions. And that's basically, this is a modeling exercise from Park Williams that shows that in the future we're going to have more severe drought and to some extent more extended drought. So this is unfortunately what's expected in the future. And so the question from that is, what can we expect in terms of how are forest fires and how are our ecosystems going to respond to future climate? And because of sort of this concern with high severity fires, managers are trying to prepare forests to become more resilient to future climate change and drought, and to reduce fire severity, especially in the wildland-urban interface. And so there's a lot of forest thinning and prescribed burning projects that are being implemented right now or being discussed, depending on the forest type. And so from that, it's helpful to know what fires were like in the past. So especially during the pre-settlement era, what the natural role of fire was, and that can help support and guide management decisions, kind of help with allocating resources and figure out where best to put your efforts. And the other reason for doing fire history research in general is just that in the past we've seen, and in the present time as well, there's quite a bit of variability in how fires burn on the landscape. And that can be within the same forest type or even in the same landscape or a similar forest type but across different landscapes. And what's my understanding is what's most helpful for managers is to have site-specific information for their landscape to base their management programs on. So fire regimes, typically talk about forest fires in the past or in the present time. It's important to know how frequent fires happen for a particular forest type, what's typical for how large they are, and what severity is common for a particular forest type. And that's both an influence of bottom-up controls, which would be sort of how variable the fuels are on the landscape and how that's influenced by aspect or slope or elevation. Some of the text that I've put in here is just an example of sort of one example of how the landscape could control fuels, which would then feed into how fire regimes would respond to that. And then the other major influence on whether fires burn or not, or how frequently they burn, would be influence of regional climate. So fire is very well associated with drought conditions, but in the historical record we often see kind of a more complicated picture than that. And it's even more complicated today as well. But one of the major top-down influences is that drought influences fire and fire frequency. One really common example in the fire history community for the regional influence of climate in the historical record is that ponderosa pine forests prior to about 1880 in a lot of landscapes of the Southwest were typically fuel limited. So there wasn't always enough fuel in the understory to promote surface fires unless there had been wet conditions for 2 to 3 years. So a really nice example is 1748. So in 1748 over here was a very big drought year. The deep brown indicates severe drought conditions. And prior to that, in 1747 and 1746, there were really quite extensive wet conditions across the Southwest. And those wet conditions created a lot of fuels in the understory so that when you had a drought year in 1748 over here, fires were extensive across individual landscapes, as well as there was what we call synchrony, where you have multiple fires burning on multiple landscapes across the Southwest. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My cell phone, I heard another call coming in. But so now this climate pattern is not as important for mixed conifer forests. In that mixed conifer forests tend to have enough fuel in the understory in the absence of sort of wet climate conditions, so that you could have extensive fires in any severe drought year without the necessity of sort of preconditioning the forest for it. So you might need maybe a little bit more severe drought conditions just to dry all the fuels out. So slightly different fire-climate relationships among the different, between the different forest types. And that's just within the Southwest. So this is sort of a backdrop for where we're going. So this study takes place in the San Juan Mountains. Durango is, for those of you that are familiar with it, this is the Animas Valley. Durango is down here. This is the Vallecito watershed up here. So the Missionary Ridge fire burned in this area in 2002, and that's what kind of brought me to this area originally. So my interest has been to compare tree ring and alluvial sediment methods of fire history, and this fire basically eroded. There was a lot of erosion following this fire, and there were debris flows kind of all along the Animas Valley here that came down from these small, steep, severely burned watersheds, and, as well as other places throughout the burned area. And so from that, it eroded older sediments in the valley bottom. So you could actually see older sediment deposits that had quite a bit of charcoal in them. So that was what I wanted to sample, and it was kind of a unique opportunity to get to sample those kinds of deposits. And then to compare them with tree rings was my ultimate goal. So in this study, I compared basically alluvial records of fire history with tree ring records of fire history. And I sort of see alluvial sediments as something kind of intermediate between tree rings and lake sediments. So tree rings provide very precise annual and seasonal records of fire covering about 500 years. So you can get a really detailed picture of fire-climate association. Whereas alluvial records cover a longer time period, but you can also use the characteristics of the sediments themselves to interpret fire severity, and it's fairly well constrained spatially in that you know what watershed that fire happened in. Whereas lake sediments tend to integrate fire information over a longer period of time and also a larger spatial area. So these was more sort of a natural choice to compare alluvial sediments with tree rings in terms of having similar spatial resolution. There's been a lot of fire history research done in the San Juans. Quite a bit of tree ring work has shown that there were relatively frequent low-severity surface fires in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, though with quite a bit of variability throughout the range. And there's also been quite a bit of lake sediment fire history done as well, and I just want to allude to that, but we won't really be discussing that today. So my study fits kind of right in the middle of the range. So all of the blue dots are existing tree ring-based studies, and this study is kind of in the center of the southern portion of the range. A lot of the existing data covers kind of a range from ponderosa pine to cool, moist mixed conifer sites, and these study sites here in the center are also a mix of ponderosa pine and more warm, dry mixed conifer. So this is the study watersheds in more detail. So I sampled six watersheds for alluvial sediments, and then in the 4 named watersheds, I also collected tree rings, and 1 watershed I collected during my master's. So my dissertation covered the Stevens Creek, Haflin Creek, and the Marina Basin. So I'm first going to discuss the tree ring data, and with that there's quite a bit to cover, but I was most interested in how fire frequency varied with aspect, and then how fire frequency was different among the watersheds, and then whether there were fire severity differences by aspect. And then finally, we looked at whether fires happened in the same years in multiple watersheds or whether there were differences in fire years among the watersheds. And then for the alluvial sediment data, we're looking at more of it's a longer term picture. You get, in this record, I have about 3,000 years of data. And so we're looking more for just general patterns in how fire activity varied over the past 3,000 years, and whether the timing of fire episodes, as you'll see, how that related to drought and wet periods, and then what we can sort of anticipate about current and future fire regimes based on the longer-term picture. So this is just tree ring method. So in each of the watersheds, I sampled as many fire-scarred trees as I could find. Those are the red dots. And then the green squares represent age structure plots. So got mostly the fire-scarred trees were on the south-facing slopes. So the two largest watersheds, let me just continue here. The two largest watersheds, Haflin Creek and Stevens Creek, had pretty different vegetation types on the south, had a strong aspect control. So the main bottom of the drainage is sort of an east-west trajectory, and then with a south-facing slope with ponderosa pine and gamble oak, and then north-facing slopes with warm, dry to occasionally cooler mixed conifer. These largest watersheds were fairly steep, and there were a lot of rock outcrops. If anyone is really familiar with the east side of the Animas, you might recognize that this drainage basin is not actually Haflin Creek, and it's not Stevens Creek either, but it was the best photo I had to show kind of what the landscape looks like. This is actually Freed Creek, and Stevens is over here, and Haflin is over here. So the Marina was the third watershed, and that's much smaller and in sort of more gentle terrain, and had a more even cover of mixed conifer. And all of the watersheds were burned fairly with almost 80 to 90% high severity fire in the Missionary Ridge fire. So for fire-scarred trees, you get an annual picture of what fires were like for past 400 years, and you can determine the frequency of fire, and then what year the fires happened in, and then by collecting multiple samples in a watershed and looking at the timing of all the fires among the different samples, you can also get to the extent. And if anybody has any more questions about methods, I'm happy to answer those now or at the end. So this is just a schematic of what the data looks like. So the one dot here represents a single tree, and then each line in this graphic represents a single tree, and then each tick mark represents a scar on that tree. So a scar represents when there was a surface fire that passed by and damaged the tree, but the tree was able to keep growing. And so in this schematic, 7 trees were sampled, represent 7 samples. And what we're most interested in is years when multiple trees record the same fire event. And that usually then you interpret that your fire burned over a larger area of a watershed if multiple samples have recorded that fire. So in a lot of the data that I'll show you next, as well as just a schematic, one example is that this is the 1818 fire year when multiple trees were scarred in that year. So these are the results of all 3 watersheds. So up here is, this is Haflin, here, Stevens Creek, and the Marina. So fire years often scarred multiple trees in a drainage basin. Some years, just a few trees were scarred. And the way we kind of try to separate out the small fires from the larger ones is we filter the data. So all the years that are listed on the x-axis represent a year when at least 25% of the trees were scarred. and sometimes you have, so for example, 1870 was the last widespread fire year in Haflin Creek and Stevens Creek. So here we can see multiple trees scarred in 1870 in Stevens Creek, as well as all the way across Haflin Creek. But years can really vary among the watersheds. So over here in the marina, 1879 was one of the most widespread fire years, but we didn't see evidence of that at all up here in the larger watershed. And that's sort of a pattern that's been noted across the San Juans, is that oftentimes fires might spread extensively in one part of the landscape, but not be recorded or spread to other parts of the landscape. So these are the results for all the watersheds. So a typical metric for fire history is to look at what the frequency of fires is. So the two largest watersheds, most of the scarred trees are from the south-facing slopes, so they represent the ponderosa pine forest. And these fire frequency values of 26 and 27 years, those were actually longer than any ponderosa pine stands elsewhere in the San Juans. And that was quite interesting, that fire didn't burn as frequently on these slopes of the largest watersheds. Whereas for the marina, even though it's sort of a warm, dry, mixed conifer, those fire frequency values were actually lower, shorter intervals than mixed conifer sites elsewhere in the San Juans. So fire spread a lot more easily in the marina watershed. And so I sort of feel like the most reasonable explanation for why the fire frequency intervals were longer here and here in Haflin and Stevens is just that it's a really rocky landscape. So it wasn't as easy for fire. Fire would, if there was ignition somewhere nearby, either within the watershed or nearby, it was more difficult for fire to spread into the watershed because there's a lot of barriers to fire spread here. Whereas with the marina, ignitions in or outside of the watershed could easily spread to the watershed, so making fire a lot more frequent than what would be typical for that forest type. And this is just sort of interesting because it points to a lot of just the variability that's been sort of noted in other studies for the San Juans. And it's also been noted in other sort of rugged landscapes. So that the area around Stevens and Haflin Creek is really quite rugged with a lot of fire barriers. There's also the stream channel in the bottom of each drainage basin, and that can tend to lengthen fire return intervals. And one study from southern Arizona found a very similar result, that in more rugged terrain you had much longer fire return intervals than gentle terrain within the same forest type. The next part of the tree ring methods were to sample multiple trees in a plot, and then just to get a sense of when, how trees were regenerating over time at the plot scale, and then to scale up to the watershed. So I took all the trees for a particular plot and lined up the ages. And when you have sort of a shallow slope to tree ages, basically that means that you have continuous recruitment. So a few trees are being established sort of every decade throughout the 1700s and 1800s until sort of the beginning of fire exclusion, where you get a bunch of trees coming in because the natural fire regime has been disrupted. And these are just the results for Haflin Creek, but what we found that there was oftentimes continuous recruitment on the south-facing slopes, which supports low-severity fires, the interpretation of low-severity fires. Whereas on the north-facing slope, a lot of the trees were generated in a very short period of time, within 10 to 15 years of a very widespread fire event, the 1818 fire year. So my interpretation from that was that a lot of these trees are filling in openings in the forest, and so there was likely high severity fire on the north-facing aspect over here, in contrast to kind of a dominance of low severity fire in the south-facing aspect. I'm going to move through this just a little bit more quickly. This is just sort of a repetition of what I just showed. I want to make sure I have enough time to show the sediment results. This is sort of similar. This is a similar picture, just a different way of looking at the age structure data. So red here is ponderosa pine. So here for Haflin Creek, we tend to have a dominance of ponderosa pine regeneration and also sort of continuous recruitment through time. Whereas here we see that most of the trees on the north-facing aspect regenerated following the 1818 fire, and that they were a lot of white fir and Doug fir. And that same pattern is seen in Stevens Creek, especially on the south-facing slopes, dominated by pine. Though not as clear evidence on the north-facing slopes for patches of high-severity fire, though the recruitment is more peaked, kind of indicating some kind of low to mixed severity fire on that aspect. But in general, there is a strong control of vegetation composition by aspect as well, which fed back into the fire severity differences that we see. This is some of the most interesting stuff. So this is the fire climate. So this is Palmer Drought Severity Index. So these low years right here are very dry, very severe drought years, and that there's a lot of variability between wet and dry years from one year to the next. So most of the fires, so the red here represents years when you had fires in multiple basins in the same year. That was a minority of fire years. Whereas the green represents fires that were only in a single watershed. So most of the fires actually, 27 of them, and the majority of fire years, burned in only one watershed in that year. They tended to be during moderate drought years because most of the fire years are below average PDSI plot. And then the synchronous fire years are associated with more extreme drought. These are Superposed-Epoch Analysis plots. And what this shows is that you have, this is an average of all climate conditions for years that burned in only a single drainage basin. So moderate drought would lead to fires in a single drainage basin. In contrast here, more severe drought is associated with when you have fires in multiple basins. But what was probably more important is that you actually had wet conditions for the years leading up to that extreme drought year. And what that means is that it sort of increased fuels across the landscape and made it easier for fire to spread kind of into some of these watersheds that maybe had some fire barriers. And so if you had wet conditions, you could really increase the fuel connectivity across the landscape. But again, that wasn't really happening in the majority of years. This was sort of the minority pattern. This kind of summarizes basically that there is the influence of regional top-down climate, though it really interacted with local controls from the terrain that influenced fuel loadings locally and sort of contributed to whether you had more severe fire or whether you had longer fire return intervals on the landscape. So I'm just going to keep moving. This is kind of a summary of things I've talked about, but I want to move on to the sediment records. So tree ring information about historical fire regimes is really valuable because you get a very detailed pictures of how fire and the landscape interacted with climate to produce the fire regime. But because we have such a warm and dry climate projected for the future, it's important to look at climatic periods in the past that were as when droughts were known to be as severe as kind of what we're expecting in the future. So this work kind of focuses on the medieval climate period when there were multiple extended periods of drought, and what we're really curious about is what fires were like during this time. So that's sort of the value of the sediment records. This study here just adds to a growing record of alluvial sediment records across the western U.S. In contrast with tree rings, we really don't have as many of these records, so kind of any opportunity to sample them is valuable. So like I said earlier, all of the debris flows that happened after the Missionary Ridge fire created these exposures of older sediments that oftentimes had a lot of charcoal in them. This is an example of one of the exposures in Haflin Creek. And if we zoom in on it, you can see burned soil surfaces here and older debris flow deposits that are full of charcoal in them. So I measured all of these exposures, and then I took samples from individual units, and then I took charcoal and separated it out from the sediment deposits and submitted that for radiocarbon dating. In total, I had 48 radiocarbon dates from all of the watersheds. So what we're really interested in with the sediment deposits is being able to identify high-severity fires in the past and distinguish those from deposits that represent low-severity fires. So anytime in the stratigraphy that we found very thick debris flow deposits, that is an interpretation or representation of high-severity fire because it takes a lot of runoff following high-severity fire to produce that coarse and thick of a deposit with such large boulders in it. Whereas low-severity fires don't tend to remove as much of the understory, and the overstory fuels remain intact, so you tend to not move as much sediment afterwards. So the deposits, they oftentimes still have a lot of charcoal in them, but they're very fine-grained. So I'd try to classify deposits on sort of one end of the spectrum or the other. There's a lot of in between as well. But in summary, I had 34 fire events over the past 3,000 years, and the red represents high-severity fire events, and the green represents low-severity fire. So I kind of just focus on the high-severity fire here, and what we had was like 4 distinct periods of fire activity is what I would call it. So kind of roughly 500 years ago, there was a pretty high peak in high-severity fire, and then here during the medieval, this is the medieval climate anomaly, the medieval warm period, there was also increased fire activity, as well as kind of about 1,500 years ago. And then a decent period about 2,500 years ago that I don't really have time to discuss today, but this peak has also been noted in some lake sediment records, whereas lake sediment records can't really distinguish these peaks here. So from what we know about fire climate associations so far, basically what we learned in the tree ring record is that it takes a couple of wet years to produce enough fuels to have sort of an extensive fire and possibly severe fire on north-facing aspects. And then the other kind of fire climate association that we know is during the 20th century, we also have fire during severe drought years, and that these fires are becoming more severe on this end because of an absence of fire during the majority of the 20th century. So that is also sort of an analog. So basically the idea is if you exclude fire from a landscape for some period of time, or if you prevent fire from happening, you can build up enough fuels to increase your fire activity during severe drought years. So it's sort of with this background that I looked at the fire-climate relationships for the sediment record. So this red curve here, that's the high-severity fire that I reconstructed from the alluvial sediments. And then this curve here is the Palmer Drought Severity Index for the four corners. So above the line, so any time that I've highlighted some of these with red are drought periods, usually extended or severe drought for at least a decade. And then the blue here corresponds to kind of wet or kind of on average wet conditions. One of the most significant of them is here during the early 1300s. It's known to be quite kind of wet conditions for at least a couple decades. So I was looking sort of for the correspondence of, I was looking for whether there was a wet period that preceded a fire peak. And certainly in this case here, it did. Now there wasn't much severe drought that promoted this earliest fire peak, but you could have severe fire in any individual drought year that wouldn't necessarily register on this smooth record of drought severity. And then here, there was some wet conditions in the middle of the medieval climate anomaly and sort of average conditions just preceding it that may have been responsible for building up enough fuels so that during these extended drought periods here, there was a decent amount of fire activity that responded. And then this is actually here at the end, this is around 1500 is one of the highest peaks in the record, and that could have been promoted by either of the late 1500s drought or a mid-15th century drought that was pretty severe. And there were likely enough fuels on the landscape because of this kind of early 1300s alluvial period. So there is a decent amount of correspondence between both extended drought periods as well as wet conditions to build up enough fuels. I didn't feel like the correspondence was always clear, and because you can have fire activity in the absence of severe drought, and you can also have fire activity in the absence of wet conditions to build up fuels. And so, I mean, my general interpretation is that wet and dry conditions over multiple decades is driving the majority of the fire activity, but it's not the only fire climate association. And it's not really the only, there's possibly like local scale factors in terms of the landscape and the geologic system that are influencing some of these peaks. What's nice to see is here, this low severity fire that kind of dominates the record, the sediment record in the last 500 years, also corresponds to the tree ring record, which really has already shown us that there's frequent low severity fires are kind of the dominant fire regime during that time. And just before we end, I want to kind of just discuss a little bit people who work with alluvial sediment records and and are really concerned for climate change, and we're all concerned for climate change, but tend to wonder whether the tree ring records are not really an adequate predictor of what to expect in the future, because we haven't seen very severe droughts during the tree ring period, sort of the last 500 years, relative to what we're expecting in the future and relative to what we've seen in the past. And what we sort of kind of see from the sediment record is that the climate system itself, especially kind of here and here, it can actually lead to severe fire activity in the absence of human influence on the forest. And it's also known that kind of the early 20th century, it's been quite wet in the 20th century, and that we may have had enough fuel buildup anyways. And I just wanted to kind of superimpose, this is a graphic from Pete Poulet, Julie Korb, and Roz Wu's work on Lower Middle Mountain. And it just fit really nicely. It was easier to squeeze this here than to try to squeeze one of my fire history chronologies into this space. But I just want to give the perspective of, so this is where the tree ring records fit in. And I just kind of want to point out here the lack of fire activity in the 20th century based on from fire suppression and fire exclusion. And so if we just look at the sediment record, I know I've squiggled a lot across this. It's easy to sort of kind of assume that we'd probably have severe fire today without the human influence. But I do think that the human influence, I think it's hard to ignore this. And I think that it certainly exacerbated whatever fire severity or fire behavior influences that the climate system would have produced anyways. And I just want to just going to skip over to a couple of anecdotal things. So one thing that seems unusual and kind of still puts the Missionary Ridge fire kind of off the scale of anything I can interpret from the paleorecord is that so all of the previous fires that I interpreted, they all deposited sediment in these valley bottoms, whereas the most recent fire actually excavated all of that sediment out of there. And so it kind of points to the Missionary Ridge fire was probably higher severity than anything we can interpret from the paleorecord, at least the last 3,000 years. And also brought down a ton of wood that's filling up the drainage basin. I have never seen, you just don't see that amount of wood. And so it kind of points to a higher amount of tree mortality in the recent fire compared to what I can interpret from the paleorecord, even though the paleorecord did have a lot of debris flows, which we do interpret as a high severity fire. And one final thing is that in 2002, when the Missionary Ridge fire burned over quite a lot of area that is pretty sparsely vegetated and had really old trees on it. So we sampled trees in 2002 on very isolated spots on the south-facing slopes that were killed, 800-year-old trees that were killed in the Missionary Ridge fire. So that's just kind of another anecdotal piece of that. We really, yeah, it was just interesting. We found quite a bit of old material that is sort of at risk with the fuel loads we have now. So with that, I'll leave it here and take any questions.
Great. Well, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Erica.
Thanks.
You compressed a lot of data in a coherent way in a brief period of time, so thank you.
Thanks.
So please go ahead and type questions into the chat window, and maybe in a second I'll just go ahead and unmute the line. We don't have all that many people on there, so hopefully we can have a little bit of conversation. Let's see, yeah, maybe I'll go ahead and unmute the line and we'll see what sort of questions come up. Oh, good, there's not a lot of background noise. So I guess one question I had while we're waiting for others to come in, Erica, was just on that last point you were making about the excavation that occurred after the Missionary Ridge as opposed to the deposition from some of the previous fires. And not knowing a lot about that sort of post-fire erosion process, I was just curious, and this just may be my ignorance, whether is that something that you might not be able to see because if a previous fire excavated an area, then obviously it's gone, and so we wouldn't be able to record that as sort of that absence problem?
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, clearly if you'd had a severe fire, or if you had excavated material, it wouldn't be there anymore to sample. And so, and also, I mean, it's really common, even in these narrow drainage basins, that you erode sediment one part and deposit in another. So if there's material being deposited here, I mean, it could also be excavated somewhere upstream. And so what we're seeing today and what we're sampling today is just a snapshot of deposition in a couple different places and using just the characteristics of it to represent past fires. So that's why I present this more as an anecdote. But I guess one thing that I had noticed, at least in the Haflin Creek drainage basin, is that before all this wood started filling up, is that the current fire cut all the way down to bedrock. And that in this particular drainage basin, we didn't get anything older than about 1,500 years. So the older dates kind of came from one isolated spot here, and then from some of the larger drainage basins. So I don't know if that answers your question that much, but yeah, I mean, if you had, I mean, any fire event is, I mean, a large fire event is gonna remove material. You wouldn't have, and that's kind of what I think happened here. That something happened about 2,000 years ago that took away most of the material that was the sediment that was in that drainage basin previously.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see, we've got a good comment in from Sandra, but no other questions. I guess another question I had was, this was your dissertation work. What are you working on now? Where are you extending this study, or are you working in new areas?
Right now I'm working on a project with my dissertation advisor that we're dating wood from Siberia, so we're looking at fire climate associations in Siberia. As far as the San Juan goes, I mean, I would love to collect more alluvial sediments. I haven't found more spots in the San Juans to do this, but I'd like to start exploring this summer, especially like the northern part of the San Juans. I feel like, well, there's not as much fire history from the northern San Juans, but and any alluvial records we could get from anywhere would be valuable. Tends to be more like fine sandstone landscapes tend to preserve alluvial records a little bit better. So yeah, my interest would be to try to expand this into the northern part of the San Juans or elsewhere in Colorado. I think would be really valuable and interesting.
Great. Well, we've hit the top of the hour, and barring somebody jumping in with insightful questions, I think probably makes sense to wrap it up here.
Okay. Thanks.
So thanks to all our participants for joining us today, and thanks again to Erica for a great presentation. And yeah, I'm sure good to get all the moral support and field and lab assistance. And I look forward to some of the folks on the line now joining us on future webinars. So thanks so much, and we'll close it here.
Thanks a lot.